Australia, a vast, flat country inhabited by some of the world's most recognizable and iconic animals. The majority of the world's marsupials have evolved and thrived in Australia and have become the dominant group of mammals on the island as a result of the separation the region has experienced from the mainland continents of Asia and South America. Huge swaths of desert dominate the landscape to the west, while tropical forests, woodlands, and wetlands can be found to the east and south. In the far east lie mountains, and along the 16,000 miles of coast boasted by the nation, biologically rich shorelines and cliffs are present. Even the seas off the coast of Australia are positively blooming with life. The Great Barrier Reef supports 9,000 known species of animal and counting, while the deep oceans harbor many species of large pelagic creatures. It's a modern-day wildlife enthusiast's dream. So you won't be surprised to know that Australia had a very rich past throughout its natural history. In fact, the earliest fossils ever found originate from this titanic landmass. Little traces of cyanobacteria from 3.5 billion years ago, a clear indication that evolution took hold of this land from the very start. In today's video, we will be embarking on an adventure through deep Australian time, from the Cambrian to the Pleistocene. Along the way, we will encounter strange alien life forms in the primordial seas, a unique cast of dinosaurs, and the amazing megafauna of the Cenozoic. Join us as we discover the prehistoric creatures of Australia. You might be surprised to discover, as we make our first stop on this tour of time, that Australia, often referred to as Down Under, was actually located in the northern hemisphere at this point in time, just touching the equator. This was around 500 million years ago, and the first complex life was beginning to explode into being in the warm Australian shallow seas. Early sponges formed reefs along the coastlines, which made a living by filtering algae into their bodies from the water. The ancestors of all Australia's modern-day animals were established by the end of the Cambrian, some of which were starting off more familiar than you might expect. Gastropods, such as snails, were evolving in the Cambrian, and shellfish, such as bivalve mollusks, were beginning to appear on the sea floor. Ostracods, a class of minute crustaceans, were also present, and toward the later stages of the period, early cephalopods made up the main predator stock of these seas. Some of these early sea creatures, though, were very much unrecognizable. You might have heard of, or seen pictures of, Wiwaxia, a round, soft-bodied animal that was covered in a layer of scales and 2 rows of spines to protect it from predators. This creature moved along the ground much like a slug, with one singular foot edging it along the seafloor sediment as it picked up falling particles of food with its hidden mouth. Also present in these early Australian seas was an animal called Nisonectris, a 17-centimeter-long tadpole-like animal with a broad head and paddle-like tail. Inside this tail was what scientists call a notochord, essentially a proto-backbone. This points to Nisonectris being a potential ancestor to all of Australia's modern-day vertebrate life. The notochord would eventually give rise to the backbone, providing us with the entire vertebrate world. If it wasn't for creatures like Nisonectris evolving this feature back in the Cambrian, you would not be watching this video now. Throughout the Ordovician period, life still remained aquatic. The lack of plant life and hostile atmosphere on land made it incredibly difficult for vertebrate or invertebrate life to sustain itself terrestrially. Life under the warm Australian waves, however, was continuing to develop and evolve. In these shallow seas, large schools of Arandaspis were forming. These tiny fish, only 15 centimeters in length, lacked both jaws and fins. To eat, it simply filtered food into its mouth from the surrounding water, and to swim, it simply beat its vertically flattened tail from left to right. These fish were armored, protected by tough scutes on their bodies and armored plates on their heads, in order to defend themselves against the grasping claws of eurypterids, giant marine cousins of modern scorpions. As the period progressed, the predators took on new and bizarre forms. The cephalopods that were establishing themselves at the end of the Cambrian were now the largest creatures in the Australian seas, with creatures such as Endoceras, a 3-meter-long relative of the nautilus, ruling the roost. These tentacled terrors were ambush predators lying low on the sea floor, perhaps partially buried by sediment, before erupting into life to take passing prey by surprise. The Silurian period followed the Ordovician, which lasted from 436 to 408 million years ago. The eurypterids, by this point, had progressed into some of the toughest creatures on the planet, and some of their trace fossils are very important indeed. Eurypterid footprints have been found in Western Australia that are, as far as we know, the first fossilized evidence of animals walking on land. The evolution of land plants in the Silurian allowed these animals to make their way onto the shorelines before moving further inland. When the age of the fishes reached the shores of Australia, it didn't hang around. Some of the strangest piscine predators of all time swam in the rivers and seas of Australia during the Devonian Period. Creatures that would make the strangest fishes of the modern day look tame. Gryphognathus was one such creature, a predatory fish with a curved, hooked jaw that would have been used to snare unfortunate prey items. Looking like something on the spectrum between ichthyosaur and pike, these creatures would have patrolled the waterways of Australia during the Devonian. And despite their fearsome appearance, they were only 60 centimeters in length. Slightly larger was Gulugongia, a type of rhizodont fish named after the town of Goolooong, New South Wales. This fish boasted many needle-like teeth, concealed within a long, snapping maw that would have been used to feast on small fish and invertebrates in its riverine home. Stranger still was Placolepis, a type of armored placoderm fish with 4 limb-like fins and a long tapering tail. This fish was protected by thick layers of bony plating on its head and body, meaning it was relatively safe from predators. The strangest fish patrolling the Australian oceans in the Devonian period was without a doubt Pituriaspis, which looked something like a fish wearing an alien-like Halloween mask. The tough armor that encased this fish's entire head formed strange, spike-like protrusions behind the head and on the snout, making it look like a kind of fantastical swordfish. Australia is known for its extreme wildlife, but the Devonian period showed the world just how strange it could get. The deep, murky swamps of Carboniferous Australia hid a true beast Elsewhere in the world, the top predators of the Carboniferous ecosystems were the arthropods and early tetrapods. But Australia harbored something much different. Viewed from the towering forest treetops, one might have been lucky enough to spot a colossal shadow drifting below the surface of the water, a shadow over 6 meters in length. These gargantuan silhouettes belong to Barramuda, a colossal predatory freshwater fish. The largest vertebrate of these stagnant swamps, Barramuda was a rhizodont fish, a large member of a group that grew enormous throughout the Devonian and Carboniferous periods. And Barramuda's American relative, Rhizodus, was the largest freshwater fish of all time at 7 meters in length. At the forefront of this muscular torpedo was a set of needle-sharp fangs, used for taking a firm grip on slippery swamp-dwelling prey, such as amphibians and other fish. Bursting from the murk to ambush its quarry, Barramuda would have grabbed its prospective meal from the surface of the swamp water, or perhaps even from the edge of the water, before dragging it down, thrashing the unfortunate victim to death. The Australian Carboniferous was home to a myriad of other creatures, however, many of them being early tetrapods, the first four-legged animals, some of the very first vertebrates to climb out of the swamps and onto the forest floor. Among them was Ocinodus, a creature that preceded the amphibians, discovered in 1996. Its fossils are around 333 million years old, and one in particular has an interesting fact tied to it. An Ocinodus radius is the oldest known pathological bone of any tetrapod, which the creature was shown to have fractured as the result of a wound. Just how this was sustained, we may never know. Perhaps it became the unlucky victim of a giant fish attack, or perhaps it came off worse in a fight to impress a mate. Surely this is one of the most astounding of all Australian fossil discoveries. Australian fossils from the Permian Period, which began 286 million years ago and lasted up to 245 million years ago, are few and far between, due to the ice age the area was plunged into at the end of the Carboniferous. Australia now was located much further south than it had been at the start of this journey through time. As a result, this ice age hit Australia very hard, and vast ice sheets covered the land. Many species from the Carboniferous adapted to the warmer swamps and temperate seas, perished in the cold temperatures. But life clung on. Australia, like all other continents during the Permian, was part of a global supercontinent Pangaea. Around Pangaea was one global ocean, Panthalassa. This ocean is where much of our knowledge about the animal life of the time comes from. Bivalve mollusks dominated the rocky shores of the coastline throughout the Ice Age. But life began to diversify once again when the world warmed up towards the middle part of the period. These include varying species of mollusks, starfish, brachiopods, and crinoids, and even some primitive fish. Terrestrial life would remain rare in the fossil record for a while, but for now, the seas were thriving. When the Permian extinction event took place, a horrorscape of mass volcanic activity ensued. And as a result, Australia was left with only 10% of its species. The Mesozoic had arrived. Elsewhere in the world, gigantic reptiles, some of them dinosaurs, dominated the land towards the end of the Triassic. But in Australia, as things invariably are in wildlife, changes were experienced. The largest and most impressive creatures of the Triassic in Australia were not the dinosaurs, or even the archosaur reptiles, but the temnospondyls. These primitive amphibians were diverse throughout the Triassic, but Australia saw some exceptional diversity. Microposaurus was perhaps the most spectacular, a crocodile-sized predator with a strange facial feature, two sharp tusks that protruded from the bottom jaw through its nasal openings. Scientists' leading theory on the use of these tusks is that they either aided the creature in feeding, or they were used for battling with rival members of the same species. Batrachosuchus was another Australian temnospondyl from the Triassic period. At 70 centimeters in length, this little ambush predator looked like a modern-day giant salamander, with a broad, flattened head and long, paddle-like tail. These temnospondyls would have lurked between rock crevices in streams and rivers, waiting patiently for a fish to pass by before snapping them up in their wide, cavernous jaws. Paracyclotosaurus was another temnospondyl from the Triassic and was one of the largest of Australia's natural history. At over 2 meters in length, this creature looked a lot more like a crocodile, with its long, pointed snout, perfect for ensnaring fish and small amphibians. Despite Australia's lack of Triassic dinosaurs, the reptiles were still present and provided the land with a persistent stock of terrestrial creatures to bolster the ecosystems. These were the archosaurs, reptiles that were related to the dinosaurs, birds, and crocodiles. One such archosaur was Tasmaniasaurus, just over a meter in length. This reptile had a long spinosaur-like skull and a tapering, winding tail, making it look like a kind of dinosaurian iguana. It was, of course, not a dinosaur, but its primitive, dragon-like appearance makes the relationship obvious. The beginning of the Triassic saw one of Australia's largest tetrapods of the period make an appearance, Calisuchus. This was another basal archosaur, similar in form to a slender, long-tailed crocodile. It was a genus of Proterosuchid, a member of a group that, elsewhere, were represented by some of the most powerful ambush predators of the Triassic. The Jurassic Period is when we start to see the first dinosaurs make an appearance in Australia, which came bursting onto the scene in some spectacular shapes and sizes. Ozraptor, for example, was a small theropod, roughly waist height on the average adult human man, which was surprisingly discovered by 4 schoolboys in 1967. Initially believed to be a kind of extinct turtle, the bones were re-evaluated in the 1990s and were later proclaimed to be the shin bone of a new genus of Australian theropod dinosaur. It lived about 169 million years ago, and to say the first traces of the creature show up halfway through the Mesozoic era, it is actually the oldest known Australian dinosaur, and the only Australian theropod we know of from the Jurassic so far. Ozraptor was by no means alone, however, and shared this land with the mighty Rhodosaurus, a sauropod that measured 5 meters in height and 15 meters in length. Although the two did not live together, Rhodosaurus represents the oldest known sauropod from Australia. This gargantuan reptile would have been a browser of high-growing vegetation, and would have needed to consume an obscene amount each day to keep its massive body growing. The idea of large herds of Rhodosaurus moving through the forests and floodplains of Jurassic Australia is surely a thought that can inspire even the most detached of us from paleontology and the world of dinosaurs. It wasn't just the dinosaurs that were making themselves known throughout the Jurassic, though. As conifers and fern forests sprung up across the continent, and vast rivers were cutting their way through the landscape, new creatures were evolving to populate them. One such creature was Siderops, a temnospondyl amphibian related to those of the Triassic. At just over 2 meters in length, it lurked underneath the sediment waiting for passing prey, anything that would fit into its broad, snapping mouth. The fish were also making big strides in their evolution in the Jurassic of Australia. Freshwater fishes, such as Archaeomyiinae, were filling the rivers of the late Jurassic, swimming on rayed fins, giving it a great deal of resemblance to many species of modern-day freshwater fish. Like many other locations in Earth's history during the Cretaceous, Australia experienced a great boon to the great reptiles on the land, sea, and sky throughout the entire period, which ran for 79 million years from the end of the Jurassic to the beginning of the Cenozoic era, famously concluded by the massive extinction event brought about by the Chicxulub asteroid impact. Dinosaurs, plesiosaurs, temnospondyls, pterosaurs, and birds were incredibly successful in the Australian Cretaceous, and some iconic species have been discovered there over the years. Starting off with the dinosaurs, the most famous genus was Metaborasaurus. This large iguanodontid dinosaur was one of the largest herbivores of the time, measuring just over 8 meters in length. This dinosaur had a very peculiar facial structure. Its snout featured a massive bulbous growth of bone in the nasal region, which might have allowed the dinosaur to create an array of bellowing, trumpeting calls, which were perhaps used to communicate, warn, or attract. Its jaws were also extremely powerful, implying that it was able to shear off sections of tough vegetation, such as the cycads that covered the Australian forests at the start of the Cretaceous. Another herbivore of the Australian early Cretaceous was Minmi, a small, armored ankylosaurian dinosaur. At 3 meters long, this browser of low-growing vegetation fed on seeds, ferns, and fruits, enjoying the diversification of plant life in relative safety due to its heavily armored back. Australia was a very dinosaur-rich area in the early Cretaceous, and not all of the herbivorous dinosaurs were big and bulky. Lilinosaura was a tiny hypsilophodont dinosaur, only 90 centimeters in length, but it boasted a tail 3 times as long as the rest of its body. Paleoartists have depicted this dinosaur in many different ways over the years, showing its tail used as a form of balance, a woolly, feathered brush for warmth, and even a flag-like signaling device used to alert other members of its family group to approaching danger. Lilinosaura was actually a dinosaur suited to polar conditions. At this point in time, Victoria, where the dinosaur was unearthed, was very close to the South Pole. As a result, the forests it inhabited would have experienced long seasons of light and dark, and these little dinosaurs would have needed to cope with long periods of cold nighttime for months on end. As such, it was likely covered in a thick layer of insulatory feathers, and was most likely a fast runner to escape the predators that lurked in the dark depths of the winter forests. Ornithopods such as these were a common sight in the forests of the early Cretaceous of Australia, and several other species have been recorded. Atlascopcosaurus is one of them, a small, nondescript ornithopod, also from Victoria, named in 1989. It was a little herbivore, about 2 meters in length. It has been the subject of much debate over the years as to whether or not it is more closely related to hypsilophodonts, such as Lilinosaura, or iguanodonts, such as Metabarosaurus. As of 2015, the latter is more commonly accepted. The sauropods lived on in the Cretaceous too, in new titanosaur forms, such as Ostrosaurus, which could grow to over 15 meters long. Paleontologists know this dinosaur from the remains of its skull and vertebrae. And judging from that vertebrae, we can see that Ostrosaurus bears a great deal of resemblance to Rhodosaurus, the sauropod we encountered in the Jurassic. Its vertebrae were not hollow, like later titanosaurs, and do not serve to make the dinosaur less lightweight, meaning that Ostrosaurus could well be a late surviving primitive sauropod, a relic from a bygone age. The theropods of Cretaceous Australia were equally impressive. The most noteworthy carnivorous dinosaur of this time and place was Australovenator, a 6-meter-long megaraptoran first unearthed in Queensland and named in 2009. We don't have anything close to a complete specimen, but the remains we do have told us a great deal about how this hunter lived. Despite the size, it was a lightweight and speedy pursuit predator that would have been able to quickly close the distance between itself and its prey before delivering swift bites with its lightweight jaws. Its jaws were lined with teeth that were rather small and wouldn't have served it too well in a life-or-death situation, however. Instead, it preferred to use its arms as its primary weapon, on the end of which were fingers tipped with curved slashing claws, perfect for disemboweling a target. Its inner 2 claws on each hand were the chief weapon used for this tactic, as they were the longest and most powerful. As of the time this video was published, Australovenator is the largest theropod known from all of Australia's Mesozoic era. As it is the case everywhere else in the world, the dinosaurs were not the only creatures populating this vast stretch of land in the Cretaceous period. Other reptiles ruled alongside the famous terrible lizards, masters of the sea and the air. The sea contained one of the most infamous nautical predators of all time, a gigantic pliosaur named Kronosaurus, after a figure in Greek mythology called Kronos, who was the king of Titans and the god of time. A fitting name, then, for such a formidable beast, now lost to time. Kronosaurus was a short-necked predator with huge snapping jaws and 4 powerful paddle-like flippers, and behind those jaws was 11 meters of muscle and might. It was the top predator of a shallow inland sea known as the Eromanga Sea, about 100 million years ago in what is now Queensland. This would have been a very cold area in the early Cretaceous, experiencing seasonal ice and temperatures that would occasionally drop to freezing levels. As such, it was likely a bulky creature, insulated by a thick layer of fat to keep it warm in the cold waters. Its chief prey was likely an elasmosaur named Woolungasaurus, which itself grew to about 9.5 meters in length. It would have been a difficult prey item to catch as a result of its sleek form and streamlined body. So Kronosaurus may have used the element of surprise to its advantage, like a modern great white shark, lurking low beneath the waves, and only making a swift movement when it's too late for the prey to realize what's going on. High above these wild oceans, flew the great winged reptiles of the Australian Cretaceous, the pterosaurs. Australia can lay claim to a few spectacular species, such as the suitably named Aussie Draco, a pterodactyloid pterosaur, only known from a single portion of its lower jaw. Nothing much is known about this aerial acrobat, but scientists can estimate that, based upon similar pterosaurs uncovered from other regions, that it may have had a wingspan measuring about 3 to 3.5 meters across, a similar size to modern-day albatrosses, giant ocean-goers with the widest wingspans of any living birds. This was dwarfed still by its fellow Australian pterosaur, Anhanguira, a coastal fish-eating pterosaur that measured 4.5 meters from wingtip to wingtip. In the forests lived different creatures entirely. The temnospondyle amphibians lived on in Koolasuchus, a huge 5-meter-long ambush predator that lurked in the streams and rivers for passing prey to wander within snapping distance. It would have been an imposing predator for any dinosaur that ventured down to the rivers to drink. Australia's Cretaceous forests were also home to early birds, high above in the treetops and safe from Koolasuchus's gaping maw. Nanantius was an example of such bird, albeit a very basal one. Their songs would have filled the forests of Australia during this strange, cold, dark time, as they fluttered from tree to tree, catching insects as they went. As we all know, the Mesozoic era was untimely cut short by the mass extinction event 66 million years ago, and the mammals and birds took over the throne of dominant species from the great reptiles. The pterosaurs, non-avian dinosaurs, and plesiosaurs were now a thing of the past, and the world was left with an array of small creatures living in the neotropical forests of Australia's Paleocene, Eocene, and Oligocene epochs. Over the course of this period, a changing cast of strange monotremes and marsupials began to rise, laying the foundations for the unique endemic wildlife that Australia is famous for today. One of the first creatures to appear was Obdurodon, an extinct relative of the platypus, with a bigger, broader bill and a tendency to feed on the water's surface. It lived in a warm, riverine rainforest, much different to the cold forests of the Cretaceous. The world, in every sense of the word, was changing. Later on, a whole host of new marsupials began to rise in the Oligocene epoch towards the end of the Tertiary. These creatures were uncannily similar to modern marsupials, but still nothing remotely like them exists on Earth today. Looking to the treetops might have allowed you to catch a glimpse of Nimbodon, a species of arboreal sloth-like wombat. On the ground, following a rustle in the bushes, you might be able to spot a Neohelos, another wombat relative, more suited to a terrestrial lifestyle, with longer legs. A stranger sight still was Nambaroo, a type of ancient kangaroo with strangely long forelimbs, much more rabbit-like in its appearance. These were strange forests, full of life, unlike anything the world had experienced yet. We now arrive at our final stop on this tour of time, this section of the Cenozoic era, which contains the Miocene, Pliocene, and Pleistocene epochs. You may well be familiar with some of the strange creatures that inhabited this time, as it was home to some of the strangest and most outlandish animals the world has ever seen. creatures that have been depicted a lot in paleoart. The Neogene saw lots of diversification within the marsupials, with creatures such as Neroborictes, a type of marsupial mole with massive burrowing claws. High above, in the treetops, lived Wynyardia, an arboreal cat-like marsupial. Icalta delta walked among them, a type of giant rat kangaroo which bounded about the undergrowth. It wasn't just the mammals that were laying claim to this land by this point, however. Among these creatures walked Bulla cornus, a gigantic flightless bird over 2 meters tall, with a huge, bulky beak. In the Pleistocene, the final stop on this journey, things began to get even stranger. This was the time of the great Australian megafauna, a whole host of large, impressive animals that dominated the continent alongside early man. While the northern hemisphere was playing host to woolly mammoths and rhinos, Australia witnessed the rise of some seriously strange marsupials. The most famous of these are Procoptodon, the giant short-faced kangaroo, and Diprotodon, a huge relative of the wombat. These animals will have inhabited scrubland and open woodland, much like that of modern Australia, coexisting with the first Homo sapien inhabitants of this isolated island world. Palorchestes was present here too, a ground sloth-like creature often referred to as a marsupial tapir, due to its strange facial structure and quadrupedal gait. Amongst the other marsupial analogues to mainland animals here were Zygomaturus, Pleistocene Australia's answer to the bear, as well as Thylacoleo, a terrifying marsupial lion, with powerful muscles and shearing teeth, adapted to a carnivorous arboreal lifestyle. It was perhaps the reptiles of the time that were the most imposing and deadly, however. The most well-known from the time is a creature called Megalania, a type of giant monitor lizard that could grow up to 7 meters in length. That's larger than a saltwater crocodile. Wonambi was a 5-meter-long snake species native to the time, named after a huge snake from Aboriginal mythology. It was a lakeside ambush hunter, readily snatching large marsupials that came by the side of the water to drink. Quincana, meanwhile, was a species of crocodilian, growing up to 9 meters in length. This bulky reptile could boast longer legs than its contemporaries, meaning that it was suited for a life outside the water for extended periods of time, capable of running in short bursts of considerable speed to ambush prey. Not all monstrous reptiles were quite this dangerous though, and this land was home to Myolania, a species of turtle around 2 meters long, the skull of which was equipped with 2 large horns for defensive purposes. Like the extinct ankylosaurs and the South American glyptodonts, this turtle carried a huge shell, protecting it from a wide range of dangerous attackers hosted by Australia in the Pleistocene. To top it all off, the Pleistocene's birds, distant ancestors of early dinosaurs, were some of the biggest of the Australian megafauna. Geniornis and Dromornis were huge. These long-necked, long-legged flightless avians were at home in the scrubland and forests of the region, a giant prehistoric analog to the emus of the present. Australia today is a country of diverse habitats and bizarre creatures, but as it turns out, this is nothing new. The continent has always hosted many wonders of the natural world, and so long as it stays isolated as a gigantic island away from the mainland continent of Asia, it will continue to remain one of the most unique places for wildlife. Modern Australia is a diverse natural world, full of wonders only relatively recently described by Western science. It is, in fact, the #1 country in the world for spotting endemic animals. That is, animals that cannot be found anywhere else in the world. This all started all those millions of years ago, with the amazing prehistoric creatures you have heard about today. This land has been wild for a very long time indeed,